Well, welcome everyone to the launch of our data diplomacy series through the National Science Policy Network, also known as NSPN. We are really excited for this great opportunity to kick off our first event, and today will be an introduction to data diplomacy with keynote speaker Dr. Eimear Kenny, Professor of Medicine and Genetics at Mount Sinai. And if you're not familiar with NSPN, NSPN is really an organization that's built by and for early career STEM professionals and engaging in training in science advocacy, policy, and diplomacy. So we really welcome you to join and connect with us if you wish to learn more about us and today's event. Next slide. So first, we'd like to start by sharing who and what has made this event possible. We would really like to thank our co-sponsor, Duke University's Rethinking Diplomacy program, for truly amplifying data diplomacy. And then I would like to introduce the team at NSPN behind this series. I'm Anastasia Burnett. I'm a data scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, where I analyze and build data interfaces concerning energy and environmental data. And I will be one of today's moderators. We also have, not here, but part of the team, Matt Contursi, who's a JD candidate at the University of California, Davis School of Law, who was behind this event's early development and its ongoing support. And we also have Ona Ambrosetta and Abigail Giles, which I'll let Abigail first introduce and then Ona.
So hi, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Abigail Giles. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge and an active member of NSPN. And I'm joining Anastasia to lead the data diplomacy series with support of Ona, who's our Science Diplomacy Committee Chair.
All right. Well, there we go. Thank you. So thanks again to the team, and to turn to the audience, I want you to consider what is data and what is its context in diplomacy. And to get there, I want you to think about these three main engaging central questions. What is science diplomacy? What is data? And what is data diplomacy, and why is it important? Why are we doing this? And then you will hear from Dr. Eimear Kenny and her work. And finally, we'll end with 15 minutes till the hour for any audience questions. And I'll let Abigail talk more about science diplomacy.
So for those of you that are joining us from NSPN Science Diplomacy Committee, our committee is focused on dedicated to educating members about topics and opportunities related to science diplomacy and foreign relations through programming like this, networking opportunities, projects, courses, and more. But for those of you that may not be as familiar with science diplomacy is not well defined because it encompasses many different types of interactions between different nations. But science diplomacy can broadly refer to any diplomatic action that uses or produces scientific knowledge to solve global problems or promote productive relationships between nations. So the goal of our data diplomacy series is, of course, to introduce data diplomacy as one facet of science diplomacy. But our bigger goal is to bring attention to and contextualize the emerging field of data diplomacy using real-world examples. And to do this, we're going to obviously host our keynote address, where we're going to consider data use and exchange to advance global health and equity. But then we'll also host a series of 3 fireside chats to explore other topics within data diplomacy. Our first fireside chat, we'll hear from 3 professionals working in data governance and security to explore data governance and user agreements to navigate international and domestic affairs. In our second fireside chat, we will feature Carolyn D'Angelo, the Deputy Chief Sustainability Officer at the Department of State, who will discuss data in global climate resiliency and sustainability. And then we're hosting a third fireside chat where we'll explore data as a currency or negotiation tool for diplomatic relations.
Great. So really excited for you guys to all attend the next series if you can. And to give kind of like a central point to where we are in all of this, in this conversation in data diplomacy, One way is to think of it like a network of relationships between data as a science, data as culture, as economy, as governance. And data is really interesting in that it's increasingly all around us. You can think about your mobile phone, which is becoming a huge source of personal data. And considering how data has evolved over time to not only be this sort of record of events or activities, but also this computer object, we really find that the forms that data can take and the ways that it can be handled greatly impact our decision making, our trades and services, how we regulate those trades and services, how this impacts nations and economies, and how data can also act as these carriers of values and identities. They can hold history and memorabilia. So really, as we continue and increasingly continue to assign value and meaning and power and purpose to data, you could define data as these sort of parcels of information that can be collated, stored, analyzed, exchanged, and can be used as this critical resource to answer some of the biggest questions facing society today through a practice called data diplomacy. Next slide. So how would we go about defining data diplomacy, and what has been our approach? Generally, data diplomacy can refer to any diplomatic action that concerns data or employs data, but we provide a framework to help think about data diplomacy. This framework has 3 themes that are rooted in science diplomacy and were inspired by recent literature and AAAS. Those themes are broken down into the following: data in diplomacy, data for diplomacy, and diplomacy for data. Data in diplomacy focuses on using data for diplomatic decision-making or assessment. It really centers more on building those data hubs and programs in which diplomacy can grow from, and sometimes diplomacy really can't move on without. Data for diplomacy leverages data or related resources to influence diplomatic relations or create partnerships. It creates that sort of incentivization of data like a currency to be negotiated or shared. Diplomacy for data involves those diplomatic decisions on data use and governance. It is where diplomatic functions like reporting, agreements, policy, and more can inform how we handle data and its flows. But as you might guess, real-world examples are not necessarily siloed. They often involve elements of each theme. Next slide. So here is a really quick, large way to get a sense of where some real-world examples might fall in this framework. And I'll mainly touch on one example from each theme. In the top left corner, an example of data in diplomacy can look like the Information Management Unit at the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. That's because they set out to establish these humanitarian deployments and data initiatives across the world that produce data that can help with emergency crises and said targeted responses. In the bottom left corner is more of an example of data for diplomacy, which can look like Genomic Surveillance Unit at the UK's Wellcome Sanger Institute. Not only have they really deployed these extremely interoperable genomic surveillance systems, but their data and work has generated these great global partnerships. So it is their services and collaborations that help meet pressing needs of infectious disease research like COVID. And finally, on the right is an example of diplomacy for data, where multilateral agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement governs our data and critical technology flows to countries like Japan, Vietnam, and Australia. And it also balances between that free flow of data and data security, and has this sort of encompassing history centered on trade regulation and trade law. But Abigail will sort of conclude on exactly why this all matters.
So why is data diplomacy important, and why is it relevant to you? So there's increasing interconnectedness between countries due to increasing globalization and the expansion of science and technology. Global problems today can only really be solved in cooperation. So some of the biggest challenges we're facing, like climate change and pandemics, they affect everyone in the world, and thus they can only be overcome by working together as a global population. And so data enables us to identify some of these emerging issues, the potential solutions to these problems, and also kind of reflect on our past mistakes, but is also becoming a source of socioeconomic and geopolitical power. However, data accessibility, infrastructure, and expertise are not uniform across all nations. So some people don't have access to ways to collect data or ways to share data. And also data doesn't represent all populations equally. So the importance of data diplomacy becomes a necessary tool for harnessing the power of data, which is becoming so ubiquitous in our lives, unifying global efforts that involve data, and addressing inequities, or creating the frameworks to achieve these things. But some of the challenges to data diplomacy include accessibility, representation, interoperability, security, ethics, trust, and more. And so some of these things we're going to hopefully explore in the series. And basically, we want to give kind of a holistic overview of data diplomacy and help you recognize how this is relevant in your life. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Eimear Kenny, a professor of medicine and genetics at Mount Sinai, and also the founding director of the Institute for Genomic Health at Mount Sinai. Dedicated to improving global health and advancing equity in medicine, Dr. Kenny leads international efforts to collect and share genomic datasets that better represent global populations. Dr. Kenny recently received the Early Career Award from the American Society of Human Genetics in recognition of her scholarship and is a sought-after speaker. And today, Dr. Kenny will explore how genomic data is used to advance global health through international partnerships and some of the challenges to this work, using examples from her career and using some discussions of some of the really interesting international partnerships she's involved in today. So we'd really like to thank Dr. Kenny for being here with us and to kind of explore this topic of data diplomacy. And so without further ado, I'll let Dr. Kenny go ahead and share her slides.
Great, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Also, yes.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, great. All right, well, hello everybody, or good evening if you're on the East Coast. I am honored to be, I believe, one of the inaugural speakers at this network and meeting. It was a very interesting exercise to put this talk together, and as I'll speak to you a little bit, it sort of almost covers the entirety of my scientific career. So it was some of it was really harkening back to the early days, and that was really interesting. But I tried to put some thoughts together, not only on where we are with genomics on the global stage with regard to data diplomacy, but also where I think we might be going and what the next 5 or 10 years will hold for us. So I titled this talk Data Diplomacy in an Era of Massive Scale Genomic Data. And the theme that's going to go through this is really the scale at which we're generating genomic data in the world and what it's going to mean for society. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge my relationships with industry, including personal fees from Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, 23andMe, and Illumina, and that I serve on the advisory boards for Encompass Bioscience, Foresight Labs, and Galateo Bio. All right, so let's start in the beginning. Not the beginning of human genetics, but you could say the beginning of human genomics, which was the release of the articles on the 15th of February 2001, 2 articles that detailed the initial sequencing and analyses of the human genome, at least the first draft of the human genome. It had been released publicly online the summer before, and this was such a landmark moment in the field of human genomics. It was a pursuit for about 15 years. It was a lot of work from thousands of scientists, and it was in the end a partnership really between industry and government funded researchers. And this has led to a landscape in human genomics that is very interesting due to the acceleration of capability and the plummeting of costs of sequencing data. So here is a slide from the NHGRI website, and the slide URL there is in the bottom if you're interested in it. It goes up to 2021, and it shows you how the cost per genome of genome sequencing has reduced over the past 20 years. And you can see right around the mid-aughties, this extreme plummet in the cost. So it's to give you a side-by-side comparison, there's Moore's law, the speed of Moore's law, that's on the white line, and the green line shows you the plummeting cost that happened in the sort of mid-aughties through early 2010s. Now, I have to say, people often speak to the plummet in cost of sequencing, but actually for the last 10 years, we have not seen that plummet continue. In fact, we've seen a rather plateauing of cost right around the $2,000–$1,000 mark for a genome sequence. That is until very recently, and 2022 was a bumper year for sequencing, and there was many advancements and excitements and announcements to do with another big plummet in cost. There was a couple of reasons for this. One was the patent on some of the technology that one of the big companies, Illumina, had ran out. So that meant that many other companies kind of came onto the market with their products and offerings. And that increased the competition, and it induced not only those companies, but also Illumina and other companies to really start to market products at the $200 to $100 mark for genome. So that's a up to tenfold reduction in cost. It's another plummet, and with plummets comes accelerating innovation, excitement, and a lot of predictions about what's going to happen in the near future. This time is no exception, and so there's a lot of chatter about what this is going to mean, particularly for how we're integrating genomic information in human health. So to give you a sense of the scale of data that's being generated by genomic technologies, this slide's a couple of years old at this point, but I think it makes the point very well. And I put this together through public resources from YouTube, also from other large scientific international endeavors, like, for example, physics, the Large Hadron Collider in CERN. And it's just doing a side-by-side, looking at the amount of data generated by these endeavors and technologies. And you can see that genome sequencing, just by this one company, Illumina, is about 50% more than all the social media content posted on YouTube that year, and about sixfold more than one of the biggest international projects for physics. So it really is the case that genomic technology is creating our biggest databases of information. I put knowledge on this slide to remind myself to point out information doesn't necessarily equal knowledge. It is a step to go from information to knowledge. And that step turns out to be super, super important. So I wanted to start and just think broadly about how genome sequencing has impacted human health in the last 20 years. And there is a big case to be made that it has had a massive impact. There's also a big case to be made that it hasn't met the expectations or the promises 22 years ago when it was announced. And I'll get to that in a minute. So one of the ways in which genome sequencing has benefited humans came to light in the last 3 years, with the extent to which genome sequencing, both in terms of pathogen surveillance and in vaccine generation, was at the forefront in our fight against COVID. All around the world. I think any lab, any university, any company who had PCR machines and sequencers got them to work on surveillance, and really started to make strides to track and monitor different waves of different strains of COVID. And then, of course, the vaccines that were had that rapid rise into production and into the arms of humans were all mRNA, DNA-based genome vaccine technology. Of course, there's other ways in which genomics is directly benefiting humans. You may have heard of classes of therapeutics called genetically targeted therapeutics. There's an example here with specific therapies that can target normal, so-called quasi-normal genes in patients where they have genetic modifications that cause disease, and you can target those to specific cells, and these can be very good, albeit extremely expensive therapies with sometimes astounding results for classes of diseases that are amenable to this type of therapy. The other area of great promise is using liquid biopsy for early detection of cancer, and there's a lot of excitement about using these blood tests to detect early signs of myriad types of cancer, in order that therapy and health management can get in early and hopefully with greater success. And then the ways in which we're using genomic data in clinical genetic testing and health systems for diagnosing rare diseases. Rare diseases are called rare because they're uncommon individually, but as a class of diseases are actually not uncommon at all. And there's over 300 million people worldwide who suffer from a rare disease over their lifetime. And genomic sequencing and testing in the clinic is really at the fore of achieving a molecular diagnosis more quickly and reducing a diagnostic odyssey, and maybe even helping to with health management and accuracy and with therapeutics. And then, of course, there's the economic impact of genomics. And this is a report that was commissioned by the American Society of Human Genetics a couple of years ago and released last year, where they showed overall that human genomics and genomics in general contributes to about $265 billion to the US economy annually. And if you want to know comparatively what that is, that's about 6 to 7 times bigger than all of ag, fishery, and forestry. And it's about the size of the entertainment industry here in the US. So it's not a small sector. It's having a major impact on humanity, and it is touted to grow continually into the future. So I wanted to think about this question of how has data diplomacy impacted human genetics, and I really couldn't figure out if it was how has data diplomacy impacted human genetics or how has human genetics impacted data diplomacy. I'm still not sure about that one. Maybe at the end of the talk we can have a conversation about that. And I wanted to think about a few different ways in the last 20 years at which I've been in the field for about 25 years. I have seen this happen, and some of the lessons that we have learned along the way. So thinking about genomic data sharing as a tool in diplomacy wasn't initially the way I was thinking about this, but then I thought of some examples. I thought, oh, wait a minute, that's exactly what happened there. So one of the most famous examples in the field of genomics is actually around the sequencing of the first draft of the human genome sequence. So this was announced and as a major achievement. It was during the era of President Clinton's presidency. And it was touted really in grandiose terms as an epoch-making triumph of science and reason, that this new technology and the knowledge that will come from it will gain immense new power to heal humans. And the two people that you can see here on the Time cover are Francis Collins at the back and Craig Venter toward the foreground, but the path to their working together in this announcement was not smooth. In fact, it was the opposite of smooth, and probably one of the most famous acrimonious relationships in the history of our field. Looking back to the early aughties, you can sort of get a sense of the history. Francis Collins and Craig Venter were both NIH researchers, but around the early 90s, Craig left NIH and to start a private business with the intent of leading genome sequencing data business. The business is called Celera, whereas Francis Collins led what was to become the International Human Genome Project, with sequencing centers mainly across the US and Europe. And both were committed to sequencing the first draft of the human genome. Their approach differed in the sense that the HGP project really saw itself as convening a coalition of the willing globally, and had a very important meeting in Bermuda in 1996, where it was decided that all data generated from this effort would be released nightly and publicly, because it was so important to disseminate knowledge as soon as it was coming off the sequencers in this project. And a large part of the acrimony between the two groups with a similar aim was a lack. It was really around this issue of public access to data. So there was a lot of disagreement and really a failure to build an alliance across federally funded research and industry because of a disagreement of views regarding public access to data. And it was really, in the end, diplomacy that helped to bring the two sides together in a way that there was really, at the end, no winners, no losers, and much more collaboration and cooperation. And the two groups, after many, many years of acrimony, eventually did agree that they would cross the finish line together. They would make a joint announcement together. Here you see the day that both Francis Collins and Craig Venter and President Clinton announced the first draft. They also co-published back-to-back papers in the journal Nature on the 15th of February. But this came about very much through diplomatic channels, with many prominent politicians, including President Clinton and Tony Blair in the UK at the time, and many other prominent scientists getting involved to really put the case that a collaborative working agreement and alliance together would be of best benefit to everybody. And this was really acknowledged in the announcement by President Clinton, that acknowledges that from this moment forward, the robust and healthy competition that has led us to this day will be coupled with enhanced public and private cooperation. So it's really marrying and acknowledging the different incentives in public and in private scientific endeavors, and how do people come together for the common good. So with that sort of lesson in mind, I really wanted to think about the subsequent years and how genomic data has really shaped digital sharing, not just of biological data, but also of lots of different data types and internationally. And I'm going to start and talk about a project called the 1,000 Genomes Project. The 1,000 Genomes Project was set up in about 2008 with the plan and intention to sequence 2,504 individuals from 26 populations all around the world. And the objective was multifold, but key principle among them was number one, to build a data resource that would help us understand genetic variation in human populations and really characterize it. And number two was a technical objective, which was to increase the accuracy and sensitivity of DNA sequencing technology to be able to scale to the scope of 2,500 individuals. And at the time, at the start of the 2,500 individuals today is something you could, run in a week, maybe on some machines. But at the time, this was a project that took 5 years to complete from inception. And I was one of the scientists in this project, and I can tell you there was hundreds of us, and we put an enormous amount of effort into not only building and hardening our technical pipelines, but also cooperatively working together across many different countries and many different labs. There was an enormous amount of effort to centralize and share data. And the objective in this project, as it was in the Human Genome Project, was that data should be openly released. So this is what that looked like. This is work led by the Paul Fleechek and Laura Clark at the time, where they're really describing what it took to pull that community together. This is the pipeline for which they both generated data through myriad production groups, again, in the UK, in the US, and other places. The types of infrastructure it took to centralize that data so that software pipelines could be run over it, mirror it across multiple repositories that were owned by different entities. So in the US, it was NCBI, in Europe, it was EBI. The types of agreements that needed to be made around initial quality control and file integrity. Remember, this was one of the first times that we were sequencing humans to this scale. So even just multi-sample calling, the types of QC, QA, the care that went into calling particularly indels and structural variants in this resource were enormous. I had hundreds of eyes on it. The ways in which the data was released to the public simultaneously. So it wasn't like the internal investigators got to see it and work with it and play with it months before everybody else. No, the data was released publicly as well as to the internal investigators at the same time. And that really helped set the standards for openness and transparency in the global genomic community. And a few of the lessons that we learned from that endeavor was really around a sort of psychological almost move away from the kind of lab-based science that most of us had done until that point into this new world of centralized large-scale genome data sharing, incorporating many learnings from computer science world and other fields that were very data science, data-driven fields, and also tailoring those to things that worked best with genomic data. Because of the open sharing nature of the project, what we saw was a rapid evolution of analyses and processing methods that were driven by a community effort, and not only individuals within the consortium, but many, many others outside the consortium. And this really did two things. It provided very effective tools. It helped harden pipelines, and it really accelerated our understanding of the data and the type of knowledge we could extract from each genome. And I'm putting there on the slide the link to the International Genome Sampling Resource, which was set up at the end of the project to be the biorepository in perpetuity for genomes that could be shared under this model. Now, this was released, I think, about 2015. About 8 years later, there actually aren't that many additional genomes on the International Genome Sampling Resource, because that resource requires the same type of centralized, publicly open access data sharing consent, and that's actually a very rare consenting model. Majority of times, DNA data is maintained in access controlled ways for lots of reasons, including that there are issues of re-identification with genomic data, even when the data is completely anonymized, and that the entities, researchers, funders that are resourcing the generation of the data have different incentives around data sharing. And so really how the field has evolved is more in this direction, and this is the Global Alliance for Genomic Health, which is one major international body that has organized itself around developing the right frameworks and infrastructure for responsibly and ethically sharing data, but not necessarily needing to do that in a federated way. And it is a coalition of not only researchers, but ethicists, legal experts, and citizen scientists. And in addition to providing sort of frameworks, it also really thinks about society and societal attitudes and questions around sharing genomic data. You know, at the formation of GA4GH, there really was not existing a lot of policy frameworks and technical standards. So technical standards really evolved with the field, and I would say scientists feel very comfortable around technical standards. We feel like we're trained to know how to develop technical standards. And then the question is how you scale those and what happens when you scale. However, not necessarily trained in developing policy frameworks, and really need to work with other experts in the fields of ELSI and the fields of policy and others. And what we do with regard to genetic data, since genetic data is really the canary in the coal mine, because we have this technology that differs us from other types of biological data, can be useful down the road for other types of biological data as it starts to scale up, and even health data. And importantly, this complex infrastructure that was put in place by GA4GH with regard to policy and frameworks is not focused only on an idea of centralized data sharing. It is very much also about federated data sharing. And what do I mean by that? Well, there are multiple ways that one can share data. One that's often thought of and perhaps easy to understand is that the data is centralized somewhere and made research ready and harmonized, and either hosted on a HPC or on a cloud where researchers can access it and operate pipelines. However, another model is to not centralize data, rather to host data locally, and then to have APIs and softwares that can access remotely and analyze that data and collate results, and layers of data security and access can be put on top of that for government governance and regulation. And the advantage of such an approach is really that it multiple fold. So number one, it can alleviate some of the legal and ethical concerns that can be raised by data sharing. Although it should be said, it's not a panacea for all, and the ethical and legal concerns can remain whether or not you are doing some centralized databasing or a federated approach. But it is a way in which there is local control over data, which may improve not only accountability and trust, but also an individual's ability to exercise their rights over data, including things like withdrawal of consent or adjudication of who gets to use the data. And these types of federated approaches may actually encourage a greater willingness among non-Western or underrepresented populations or individuals from constrained resources areas of the country or the globe who may feel that they're outcompeted by the types of resources available in some of the more affluent institutions and may not like that approach for doing data analysis. And I'm going to point you to one of the models for doing sort of cloud-based computing in a way that can be centralized or federated, and that's the AMVL. This is NHGRI, Analysis, Visualization, Informatics Lab Space. There are many others out there of a similar flavor that enable sort of more democratized, they call it, user interaction with the data. And so next I'm going to talk about a little bit pointing to the future about how genomic data in healthcare systems, I think, is poised to have an even bigger impact on data diplomacy beyond what we've already seen with these large international efforts for sharing research data. So here's a review that came out a couple of years ago, led by Stark et al., and it was Ewan Burney and Katrin North. And it really looked at the rise of genomic data in healthcare. And this is rapidly on the rise in a couple of ways. So many either single payer countries or large tertiary academic health systems around the world are recognizing the value of investing into biobanking and databasing of their patient data for research purposes, and creating that infrastructure to be able to do that. The other thing that's happening is that genetic testing is becoming more proliferate in health systems, and whether or not a health system has a biobank, just depending on how quickly that data can get digitized and linked to health systems data, means that de facto some health systems are going to become biobanks. Here's a review that we wrote about biobanks around the world a couple of years ago now, and it really shows you the types of emerging programs. And on the y-axis here is also marking the extent of diversity in these efforts. They can be a little bit more diverse than their traditional research cohorts, but it's still not hugely diverse. But the point I want to make here is that healthcare-based genomic research and testing can have a different and sometimes quite complex financial, legal, and social landscape. And the health systems may have different incentives around data sharing than researchers at universities or other entities do. So I want to point to a study that has been published recently, led by Wei Zhao from the Broad, with many collaborators at health systems in biobanks around the world, showing that even in this landscape of different incentives, you can, or Wei can, really was our fearless leader, pull together a community of researchers who will be willing to share at least summary level data to facilitate the kind of major meta analyses that we need to do these days in order to have best opportunity for genomic discovery and using genomic information as genomic predictors. So I'm going to end, I'm a little tight on time, so I might do this very quickly, just making one or two points about biobanking in our biobank here in New York City. That's the BioMe biobank. I'm going to maybe skip over this for now and just point to not just the research aspects of the value of genomic information, but also the patient care aspects. And many of these biobanks, about a third in 2019, and that number's probably going up, are, even though these biobanks were generated for research, are actually committed to returning genomic results. And it really is touted as the beginning of an era of genome first medicine, where individuals who have their genome sequenced in health systems, whether it's via biobanking or whether it's via genetic testing, if health systems have the opportunity to constantly look up that data depending on the clinical context and questions they may have for that individual. And so you can really think about moving away from traditional genetic testing, which is really focused around rare disease or cancer screening, into sort of really examining DNA for everyone to understand disease risk over the course of a lifetime. As here are some of the potential benefits of an approach like that. I want to point out we have developed a genomic screening program here in New York City, which launched in 2019, where we have been returning results for participants in our Eimear biobank when they have variants that are pathogenic and we deem to be medically actionable. Here's one of our early experiences returning results for pathogenic variants in BRCA1 and 2, where the clinical activity following those disclosures included uptake of several risk-reducing interventions and cascade screening of family members. We've now actually scaled this up into a clinic that sits in clinical care that screens for genomic risk of disease, and we have really expanded these programs to add diseases and disease-associated genes that really impact the families and communities within our health system. So, for example, hereditary TTR amyloidosis, where there is an autosomal dominant pathogenic variant at 4% in African American populations here in New York City. And that has led our health system to really see the value of and invest more deeply into biobanking. And we launched this summer the Mount Sinai Million Health Discoveries Program. So I want to leave time for questions. So I might just stop there and leave this slide up in case any of these points come up. And I will pass it back to you.
Well, I'll just say thank you. That was an excellent presentation, and you covered a lot of the points that we were hoping to cover. It's really interesting to hear how genomics is being shared between different entities and different nations, and some of the challenges to that, but also some of the really successful examples that you shared. So thank you so much. I guess I'll see if, does anyone have any questions to start us off?
I had a question.
Okay, go ahead, Grace.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm Grace. I'm a PhD student of Elizabeth Atkinson's at Baylor College of Medicine. And I was, as you were talking about different incentives of the, both healthcare systems as well as, these big global initiatives as well as government. One thing that I guess came to mind to me was also that, industry in some of these, places like, like GeneDx and I'm trying to remember the other kind of genetic testing companies that are private. Of course, they probably have very different incentives as well. Are you seeing any kind of efforts to amass data in that respect, and could you speak to some of the challenges that come to some of these genetic testing companies and direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies as well, because they have an enormous amount of data, and of course a lot of challenges when it comes to accessing that?
Yeah, so historically, that's a great question, by the way. Nice to meet you, Grace. So historically, data, either in those direct-to-consumer companies or in those genetic testing companies that deal directly with health systems, has been very siloed, and the classic example is Myriad. But I will point out Myriad last year released a whole heap of data from their database, which was a great step forward for the BRCA1 community. And even companies like 23andMe, who are maybe a little bit more research friendly, they got to a point where they had started to license their database that they really siloed and closed down a lot of access for researchers. But you know, I think it's a very evolving landscape, and I see a lot of incentives change. So one of the big things that's occurring is health systems themselves are starting to recognize the value not only of genetic data, but broadly of their patient data for sort of research endeavors, but also for actual revenue in terms of their interactions with pharma and other companies. And so they're coming up with models that preserve patient privacy, but allow them to interact with different entities. And genomic data is coming under that umbrella more broadly. And part of that is health systems are really understanding better how to digitize that data and store it in ways that would be more accessible for research. If you are a researcher in the health systems data, go write an IRB to get access to patient data for research purposes. So, you know, I think more to come on that, how far down that road it's going to go. But so far, those vendors that you described, not all of them, but some of them are quite amenable to serving up data in digitized ways, in JSONs, et cetera, that can then be sucked into health systems and then be linked to patient data. And that's what I was sort of alluding to earlier, where whether or not you have a biobank, if that continues to grow just by dint of the extent of genetic sequencing that's done in health systems will start to become biobanks. So until now, most genetic data in health systems is stored in PDF media files and really inaccessible to the types of mining you often do in health systems for research. But I think that that is changing, and that we will start to see that data stored in ways. I don't know how far it'll go. I don't know if a health system will ever fully get to the point where they will store a genome. Unlikely, because that opens up a lot of liability for a health system. But in terms of clinical reported information, I do think we'll see that coming into health systems in digitized ways. And I think, you know, it is very interesting. I didn't talk about pharma, but pharma is also another place where we're seeing a lot of genomic data generated, but very siloed. And it's very hard to get that data out of pharma. But of course, pharma needs to partner with entities in order to get data to generate, because they're not health systems. They don't have patients coming in the door. So through those partnerships, that data is now starting to sit in health systems. And that's what we're starting to see really in terms of growth of these biobanks. A lot of them are with pharma or other industry partners. Does that answer your question?
Yes, definitely, and more. Yeah, thanks. I hadn't really thought about it as kind of healthcare systems as a way to then get access to, as like a kind of intermediary for starting to kind of consolidate some of the things that are happening already in these genetic testing companies. Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, in health systems, they have their own incentives, and those incentives may or may not include, for example, the typical NIH model, which is, you know, when we fund the generation of data, part of what we insist is that you centralize that data, make it available broadly for research purposes to the degree that you're allowed with the consent on the data. Health systems, when they invest in capital to generate data, they may not think that way at all. And they may not think that sharing their patient data is a good idea unless that they're really, unless there's some sort of way in which the patients or the health system itself is benefiting. But, you know, I think that's where the idea, a future where we have a mixture of centralized and federated models for data analysis and data access is more likely. And some data, you're just never going to get access to the data, but you can potentially get access through different layers of solutions for federated research, get access that way. And that, I think, it's likely the landscape that we're going to be in.
Thanks so much.
Any other questions? Don't be shy.
If no one from the audience has a question, I'll ask you a question. But you started to explore this when you were looking at the federated approaches for international data sharing. But in your experience, what are some of the reasons that in under-resourced community or underrepresented group from another nation potentially, or a foreign institution, why may they not want to share data, or what are some of the reasons that maybe they wouldn't be incentivized to share data?
There's lots of reasons that they may not be incentivized to share data, and I'll just be transparent that I serve on the advisory board of H3 Africa and a number of other groups, really helping think this through and advise. But the reasons, the one reason is the one I mentioned, which is you could totally understand why you may not want to share data with, and I don't want to point fingers at any particular institute, but with, let's say, an institute that's extremely well resourced, that has a team of 30 data analysts who could just go into your data, analyze it, and publish those papers, where you may be a middle author somewhere, right? That's not a really good model for sharing data for most people, and I completely understand why. You may rather want to be in a system where you can set up your own infrastructure, or and have pipelines and know-how transferred to you, so that you could do the analysis and write those papers yourself, for example. That would be, let's say, a better model for that. And people are actively working on these models. I think I think there's also issues of trust, but also issues of centering the right questions, because unfortunately, one of the things that our research databases most resembles is our STEM workforce, in the sense that most people in STEM workforce are of European ancestry. And just by dint of our cultural experience, we often have ways of thinking about questions, and to the deprioritization, or even not thinking about some questions that others may think are more important and want to work on. And there's other disincentives as well. For about 15 years in my career, I remember this constant refrain from funders when you write a grant saying, hey, we think it's important to study disease X in population Y that has been understudied. And they would say, but why would you do that? There's all these much bigger predominantly European ancestry populations out there. So what's the added value? What value do you think you're going to find? And the answer is, of course, lots of value. First of all, if we don't study human populations, then we don't know what we're leaving on the table. We don't know what is left to be discovered. And we don't know the specific interaction between genetic and environmental and social determinants of health that impact disease in that population. So of course, there's huge value in researching diseases in different types of populations, whether that's diverse populations, children versus adult, women versus men, or people who are not necessarily on the ends of the gender binary. So we really need to think about our value system in terms of what we think is important to research, and think through questions of transferability and robustness of genomic observations and insights, not only sample size is king.
Thank you. That was very informational. So I think, just to be respectful of everyone's time, that's our time. But I'd like to thank you again for coming and talking about this topic that maybe you haven't talked about formally. So we really appreciate it. And I think that concludes our first introduction to data diplomacy, and we hope to see everyone back for our 3 remaining fireside chats. But thank you very much, Dr. Kenny. It was great.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Bye, everyone.